The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
This is something that is a crucial notion that Malthus captures in the second half of this very important work, the essay on population. So, yeah, Jennifer brought out the key directions that Malthus is going in with his discussion, including the sense that he has that, well, humans are improvable, but they're not going to become perfect. This idea of perfection is just an inappropriate idea for the human condition, given the fact that humans are always going to have this tendency to outpopulate their resources. However, it does lead to some very interesting thinking on Malthus's part. Especially, I think, in the way in which he treats the mind. There's a kind of complexity coming into his thinking here about the mind, the human mind, the idea that the human mind may actually have different elements in opposition, which Jennifer picked up on as perfectly rational people do perfectly irrational things. And this means that in the seat of the intellect, in the mind itself, there are various elements that aren't necessarily working together. So I thought it'd be worth looking at some of the context of the times, because Malthus is writing, and there's a lot going on in this period, right? At the beginning of the 1900s, just at the transition from the 18th to the 19th century. And like several of the other writers we're looking at, he is dealing with this kind of legacy of the Enlightenment, the sort of great era where the rational mind is this emerging force of human progress and innovation and all sorts of interesting possibilities, new possibilities. So Malthus is coming in and looking at the downsides. Okay, so I thought we could have a look, as he says in his chapter 13, which I asked you to read, man is basically a compound being. A being made up of different warring factions. As he says, the cravings of hunger, the love of liquor, the desire of possessing a beautiful woman. Keep in mind this is a clergyman speaking too. So Malthus is a great mathematician, but he's also a cleric, and he's a curate. He thinks in terms of the moral nature of life, of human life, and the moral imperatives upon humans and what they struggle with to sort of so he says the cravings of hunger, the love of liquor, the desire of possessing a beautiful woman will urge men to actions of the fatal consequences of which, to the general interests of society, they are perfectly well convinced. They know that these things are, you can hear the cleric coming out here, even at the very time they commit them. So we don't necessarily follow rational behavior, even when we know what is rational. This suggests another force. And what is that force? Driving behavior. Well, instinct. I mean, instinct comes in a very big way in this work. It's a very powerful force. It's something that is organically part of humans. they can't get rid of it. It's there just as much as the rational elements of the mind. Remove their bodily cravings, and they would not hesitate a moment in determining against such actions. But in their own case and under all circumstances of their situations, with these bodily cravings, the decision of the compound being is different from the conviction of the rational being. So is this inconsistent with Smith? In what ways is it consistent and how is it different? Is it the rational being who is, in what way is it the rational being who is participating in helping generate the economy? David?
I guess the rational being has to understand like the concept of society, like the benefits of like giving up your own like desires and immediate needs to like serve a greater good or greater purpose.
Okay, in some sense, but what does Smith say? It's the is it the rational being or the self-serving entity being who is involving himself or herself in the economy? It's sort of it's a basic process that is serving self-interest.
The combination of like the self-serving processes make the economy.
So the economy is not so much the product. I mean, even though you can look at it and it seems like a very rational way to, exchange goods and things of that sort, the force that drives it is fundamentally self-preservation, self-interest. And in fact, Smith even says, people who are rational, people who want to help other people and have far less impact than the people who are actually serving themselves and, enlightened self-interest. So you could say there's a big element of sort of instinctual, non-rational motivation in Smith's world as well. And that's, but how are Smith and Malthus different? Do you think Smith agrees with, do you think Malthus agrees with Smith? Claire?
Well, I mean, Smith is saying that like the self-serving instinctual interests that people have, it contributes towards creating something that works toward the greater good, like the economy. Whereas with Malthus, he's saying the instinct is what leads us to do irrational things, such as like overpopulating the world. So they kind of take a different perspective on what the consequences are of like our instinctual nature.
Okay, there's a different sort of emphasis in the outcomes of these impulses. I mean, they both, you can see emerging in these two thinkers a acknowledgement that, instinctual sources of human motivation and behavior are very, very deep. And they don't belong to the rational world. They're not part of, they can be contemplated and, the rational individual can try to control them. But as he's saying here, it's often of no consequence. And in some ways, as I said, this is also the cleric coming out saying, this is, humans don't necessarily always do the right thing. They're driven to do things that in their better moments they know they shouldn't. And, this is a very common human tale. I mean, it's not like we needed Malthus to discover this, but Malthus puts it into his system. This is part of his system. Okay. But I wanted to pick up on this notion of the compound being. Because what we have in this era is an emerging sense of, humans can do things in very irrational ways. And the example that one of the examples that Malthus cites here is the French Revolution, which was based on the highest principles, the grand vision of the emergence of a sort of state of the people, a state that is, created for the greater good and the greater benefit of humankind. And yet, it sort of broke down into, at certain stages, into, that's not to say that the principles were not themselves great principles, but it broke down into this kind of chaos of irrationality during the Reign of Terror, the very famous episode. So this question of perfectibility, I've thrown in a couple of times the words of perfect adaptation, perfectibility. The word perfect comes through here. This is part of the utopian dream of the great idealized state where all humans live in a condition similar to El Dorado in Candide. Behave rationally and sympathetically to other people, and do not worry too much about possession of goods and all those sorts of things. All right, so he uses the notion of perfectibility of a plant. And it goes back to a question of how what does it mean to say a plant can be perfected? What would a perfect plant be?
Perfect.
I mean, if you try to imagine what a perfect rose would be, it's does that mean it would be really big, or it'd have the right odors, or
Human would be.
I mean, it's hard to come up with a concept of perfection in the absolute sense when you're thinking of a biological organism.
Because you can almost always come up with something wrong. And then if you fix that, then something else is wrong.
Or something
Yeah,
wrong, or something better, or something.
Exactly.
And
We're
of
never
course,
satisfied.
there's a certain reality that as you increase the size of the, if you're actually involved in trying to make a perfect sunflower, make the head bigger and bigger and bigger, but eventually it reaches a point where the rest of the plant can't support it. This is
If you want a huge sunflower, it's just going to be like beautiful in its largeness, then it's going to fall over.
So there are limits to the way in which beings and organisms can actually be improved. Yes, they can be improved, but the notion of reaching the perfect stage is, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense in biology. And this kind of reasoning and this kind of thinking is also present in Darwin's thinking. How perfect does a being have to be in a system, in an evolutionary system?
An entire species of elk went extinct because they were too perfect for their environment. They kept, through a series of processes, their antlers kept getting bigger, and they kept reproducing because they were more attractive, and eventually they became so more attractive that males could no longer hold their heads up with the antlers, and the entire species went extinct.
Something like that, yes.
Wow.
This is an example. We'll get into a discussion like this when we talk about sexual selection in Darwin, because sexual selection is a selection process in the natural world where organisms are selected for attributes that aren't necessarily beneficial to their daily survival, but are beneficial to their attraction of mates. And you get a little conflict here. If attracting a mate means that your feathers become more and more brilliant and everything. Of course, the hawk sees So this is a problem. But yeah, how perfect does a being have to be? Just a little more perfect than everything else. More perfect is the wrong way to put it, but just a little better adapted is enough to assure the survival of the species. So the gradations in nature are not toward, quote, perfection. They're toward greater adaptation in the environment, slightly improved over competition. And you know, you can see this this kind of discussion trying to puzzle out, you know, what does it mean to have a perfect being? What would a perfect being be? Because people like Godwin and Condorcet were, you know, thinking in these sort of utopic terms. And for good reasons. They saw the possibilities of progress, and they thought, oh, progress may indeed be unlimited. We may arrive at some state. But, you know, this turns out to be more problematic than in their general discourses they really recognize. Later in the term, when we read The Time Machine, we will we'll come to a different sort of stage of a different kind of imagined world of perfection. And these are sort of it's a great thought experiment about, you know, what does it mean to be evolved to a state of perfection, to a state of sort of homeostasis, where there's some kind of perfect order and it's continually supported. Okay, so then he says, in addition, he says, in a similar manner, the forcing manure used to bring about the French Revolution and to give a greater freedom and energy to the human mind has burst the calyx of humanity, the thing that holds the flower together. The restraining bond of all society, and however large the separate petals have grown, however strongly or even beautifully a few of them have been marked, the whole is at present a loose, deformed, disjointed mass without union. So he's looking at the French Revolution as an example where, you know, the drive for perfection, the improvement of the state, the principles of human rights and the goals of human achievement were all noble, and yet somehow it disintegrated into a kind of a collective sort of a collectively shared and generated chaos. Okay, so this is a problem, and it's clear that, you know, the French Revolution had a big impact on Malthus's thinking. I mean, he saw it as a warning of, you know, the possibilities of disorder and chaos. There was a lot of thinking at this time about the mind. I mean, humans have always been fascinated with their own minds. You know, we see it in Hume. He's interested in the rational process, the use of analogy, how the mind works, the inner space, so to speak. And there were many people who were interested in developing more precise concepts of how the mind worked. And we have an early example in this important thinker. I mean, he was someone who was a promoter and developer of the pseudoscience of phrenology, which had as its goal to kind of locate functions in the brain for certain expressions of personality. But much as Gall was a sort of, as they say, pseudoscientist, or I like to say a vernacular scientist, or actually a man who was exploring many, many new possibilities, these ideas have, I mean, people still are looking in much more concrete and in successful ways that brain function today. And the notion that the brain is made up of many, many different components which interact together in various ways is, this is not a amazing theory these days. But Gall subdivided the brain into a number of faculties. If you go to that website that I've given to you at the bottom here, there's a whole section on phrenology. A very interesting science in which the brain was argued to be the organ of the mind. So you see what's happening here is a kind of a concept of the material nature of the mind. The mind is not simply a spiritual entity. It's also based on, physical things. It's physical. A second tenet was the mind is composed of a variety of innate faculties that were distinct from each other. And some of these were emotional types of thinking, so on and so forth. They had them all localized in many examples. Because they are distinct, each faculty must have a separate seat or organ in the brain. And the size of these has something to do with the amount of power they have. And brain shapes, phrenologists were very interested in, taking the measure of the head and, checking the various features of the cranium and so on to try to understand something about a person's personality. There's something a little humorous about this whole thing in phrenology, and yet it's not just humorous. As I said, we are still looking at the brain in much more radical ways now than Gall was. But you see a trend here is to try to understand the mind in a more physical, material, naturalistic way, if you will. Some things people are groping to understand. Okay, and then number 6, it sort of goes over the deep end on some of these. As the skull takes its shape from the brain, the surface of the skull can be read as an accurate index of psychological aptitudes and tendencies. And there are lots of very amusing. There's a museum, I gave you a website for a museum in Minneapolis for, pseudoscience or something, where they actually have an old phrenological machine that will test you and give you ratings for all your different personality things, stuff like that. So it obviously took a lot of time, and a lot of people were fascinated with this. But it also led to some new insights on the mind. 19th century is a great century for the development of new concepts of the mind itself. The emergence of psychology. And we find it not only in the sciences and in the way in which people began to understand education and things of that sort, but we also find it in literature. The Sherlock Holmes and some of the detective novels and the psychological novel of people like Henry James. People really interested in intermental processes and how do people process experience. And this is a great century for that. And Darwin himself was fascinated with this whole area, as we'll find when we read sections of his Descent of Man, the mental processes. So there was work being done in the 1780s. Galvani, his great experiments leading to the understanding that the nervous system itself had, behaved in ways that suggested a sort of animal electric system. And the fact that different sorts of motions in the body could be stimulated simply through the use of electric current So Galvani's experiments were very formidable step forward. I mean, in understanding the body as a set of circuits. Again, this is moving into new territory. We had Harvey in the circulation of the blood, so there's this concept of the mechanization, the body as a mechanical entity, has been developed, and again, these are sources of behavior that are located in things that aren't necessarily rational. You know, they're controlled by other forces. I think one of the things that we can see here, and we see it in Malthus, and this I'm trying to provide a little bit of context here, is that the instinct is a source of oppositional behavior, if you will, or behavior, non-rational behavior that is sometimes in opposition to rational thinking, is becoming more and more prominent. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This is a modern Boris Karloff, and here they emphasize the electric nature, and it's not quite that strong in the original Mary Shelley work, and the monster of Frankenstein is actually in some ways a paragon of reason. I don't know how many people have read Frankenstein. Okay, he has a whole sort of understanding and philosophy of life, but the notion of a being that is generated through some kind of natural force in a laboratory. This is a kind of a spectacular idea, and this idea has always fascinated popular culture. I mean, we all know the story of Frankenstein. These were all works that reflect on the incredible preoccupation of the 19th century with the mind itself and the brain, and the fact that these two things are. And we can see this kind of spirit of thinking about, processes like mental processes in a physical way as part of the spirit of the 19th century. And it emerges in the science, and it emerges in the literary works. It's in the culture. It's something that's emerging. There's a progressive sense of this. So then Malthus says, to elicit an ethereal spark from the clod of clay. So he says, God is constantly occupied in forming mind out of matter. Mind out of matter. What does he mean? What's Malthus getting at here? And do you buy it? And how does this come back to as a, I won't say a justification, but a rationalization or an understanding of the first part of his essay, in which he said, forget it. The population is always going to outstrip production, and there are going to be, all these different corrections that are going to take place. Yeah.
It's kind of saying that since God didn't create a perfect world, the intention is sort of that the work that humans have to put in order to survive improves the mind and develops it.
Yeah. So that imperfect world is what people have been given by God, and in order to survive in that world, in order to become, to exist, they have to figure out how to do things. They have to improve. And one of the great approaches to improving the world is through the mental processing of experience. Humans learn. They become better at doing what they're doing. And there's a concept of progress here. Progress as sort of delivering an improved set of circumstances for humans that has resulted from their struggles. I mean, he's trying to say you're not just a victim of this population dilemma. Humans have, they may not be capable of becoming perfect entities, whatever those are, but they can do things for themselves. They have this, this human reason, and they can do all sorts of interesting things to improve their conditions. And so there is in Malthus at least a moderate sense of progress. It's not the same optimism as Adam Smith, is it? I mean, who do you find a more congenial philosopher, Smith or Malthus? I mean, what do you make of this Malthusian? I mean, is it, first of all, do you think is it true today? Are we stuck in a Malthusian predicament? David?
Well, the biggest thing for me that I completely agreed with was the whole idea that necessity leads to invention. And you can see it in everyday life with technology and people trying to fill in needs with imagination. So in some sense that does say that we live in a Malthusian world and that we're just constantly just getting the better of it by our progress in technology. Yeah.
Okay. So you agree that there's a kind of a fundamental truth here that the conflicts and insufficiencies of life drive us, and the suffering of life drive us to innovations, of various sorts. I mean, why else would people do this? Well, you could say maybe just out of human curiosity, but the kind of progress that is being driven by the human condition seems much greater than just what would result from mere curiosity. So yeah, there's a lot of necessity here to these innovations, and they make possible all sorts of things. He uses a metaphor of a tree in one of the chapters I had you read. Anybody remember that metaphor where he talks about the tree? He talks about the leaves and all the branches, and then the trunk, and then the roots. Yeah.
He was kind of saying that, like, a person who wants lumber really only finds the trunk useful, but that to some extent the roots and leaves are necessary for the rest of the tree to grow.
Yes.
So there's always going to be some negative aspect or something else there in order to get the part that you need.
And who are the leaves?
The excessive frills of society.
What?
The excessive frills of society.
Yes, all the upper classes, and then the roots are
the underground.
lower classes,
Yeah.
the people. And his point is, what is the point of the tree metaphor? I mean, in some ways it captures.
The middle class, then?
Well, yeah, he does say, to the extent that we can expand the trunk, and this we should pursue, because Malthus really does have a moral view of the world, even though he finds it as a place of conflict and so forth. His own view of the world is deeply moral. He believes in the extent, but does he believe you can ever get rid of the branches, the leaves, or the roots?
What he's saying is that you need
them all together for them
They
to
all have to work
exist.
together.
They're all going to be there all the time. And, without the roots, you wouldn't have the tree, and without the leaves, you wouldn't have the tree. But, yeah, the idea is to try to expand the middle. So, of course, later, with, the poor people and, the fact that, many people suffered. This is what upset many people with Malthus. It seemed that Malthus was sort of accepting this kind of condition, dilemma, as simply a permanent part of human existence, and that and that he was arguing, as indeed it can be insisted, that this was going to be with us forever. There would always be the masses and the poor. And although Malthus had a theory of progress, it was matched by a general sense that even with progress, population was simply going to outstrip the possibilities, and eventually you would end up back with the same set of problems at a higher level. Any other thoughts on Malthus? He does, hold that this is all it all works out in some way. So the Malthusian system, Malthus himself, as was mentioned earlier, sort of accepts the imperfect nature of the world as a source of motivation of humans to better behavior. And in some ways, this kind of justifies the world, does it not? I mean, is he? Well, let me put this another way: is Malthus a Panglossian thinker? Yeah, Dave.
I would say no, in the sense that he doesn't feel he sees a problem in the world, whereas I feel Pangloss would more say this is the best that could happen. And then Malthus says there's an imperfection in the world. Humans aren't perfect, but that imperfection and variety leads to some mode of survival that we can all proceed with. Pangloss, I feel, would be a lot more passive in the sense, this is the best, and we should just leave it at that. There's nothing we can do about it.
He's more of a fatalist. Yeah. Okay, that's a good point. Claire, did you?
Well, yeah, but then as we were looking at when we were reading Hamid, like, he did say that the world was the best of all possible worlds, but then he did acknowledge that there had to be a certain amount of suffering, and that he was suffering of syphilis, and all of these things were happening, but, like, something good was coming of it. But I think where we have to distinguish between the two ideas, because from that point of view, like, they are similar, and that there's some suffering and there's some bad towards a better cause. But then the better cause kind of overrules everything in the world of Pangloss, but then with Malthus's perspective, like, there's always going to be some bad and nothing's ever going to be perfect. So I think they had two very different definitions of perfect and two different ideas of what that word embodied. But yeah,
Okay.
so there are some similarities, but certainly a little bit of difference.
Chris, what do you think? Is he a Panglossian?
I'd say no. It seems that he isn't as optimistic it seems that
He
it takes a very fatalistic view.
you think Malthus has a sort of a fatalistic view?
Exactly.
Yeah. And in what sense?
In that, well, we talked about his conceding the necessary existence of poverty, and so that's one example I think of. But
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, certainly there were many people who really found Malthus kind of tiresome and wrong. Is Malthus? Let me put a question in a different way. Is Malthus less right today than he was in his own time? Yeah.
We're still driven by trying to get away from pain rather than going towards pleasure. So I would say that's still very true, especially with technology nowadays. It's just so we can save some fraction of time and be lazier.
Yeah.
That sense, I'd say, is still definitely right.
Okay, so there's some kind of dynamic where we're still trying to. I mean, what are we all doing here at MIT? We're trying to improve the envelope, if you will, between humans and the natural world. Whether it's developing better sources for storing electricity or new materials to insulate or to conduct currents or whatever. I mean, all this stuff is in some ways devoted to improving the human condition. I mean, sometimes it dribbles off into just improving the pleasure of life, but that's still part of the project. But this notion that humans are in a kind of an iron vice that is caught between their tendency to outpopulate the growth of their resources. That concept is, it was very powerful and palpable to Malthus in his time. I mean, he looked around, he did some numbers, he got some county statistics, and voila, he saw, yes, indeed, death rates and so forth, fluctuate, and there's a kind of a correction that takes place through various things that people do. And if you scale that up to large numbers of people, they do very large things like emigrate in the millions and go to war and so on and so forth. The rate of change of technology in the last 200 plus years since Malthus's time has been profound. And yeah, we can keep up with populations in food and so forth. What is the limiting factor? What's the great limiting factor? Yeah.
Spatial constraints?
Yeah, space. We just, we can probably find resources to keep up with populations. If we, and the moon. Forget the moon. We'll fill that up in about, 2 generations or so. I think the Earth is our best shot, and keeping it in livable form, and trying to keep the population growth down to a dull roar, or even finding ways of limiting it and stabilizing it. Those are all great hopes. I think those are greater things to aim for than merging with computers. Myself, my own sense. Let's work with the Earth and see what we can do to make it a environment where people can live and survive without undue suffering. But we have these capabilities. They're basically, there. Organizing them, getting them sorted out, distribution, there are lots and lots of problems. But
we've had them for at least 50 years, so anyone who's complaining about not being prepared doesn't know what they're talking about.
I tend to agree with you, yeah. So that's the problem. It's just, you know, the human inability to manage the resources and the capabilities that they have. The notion of getting trapped and frozen into the Malthusian dilemma is, you know, that's something that doesn't have to be. And you know, a lot of things exist to get us out of those, or to help us get out of that predicament. But you know, as we mentioned, there are limits to space, limits to the amount of physical space that you can inhabit. So you know, at some point, populations have to stabilize, or else, you know, we'll just run out of space.